Hi and welcome to the Huddle Boomer podcast. We're not in the middle of nowhere, but I think you can see it from here. I'm Steve. I'm one of the hosts of the Huddle Boomer podcast, and we are in Polk, Nebraska, visiting my mother-in-law on the family farm. They've been farming here for generations. I didn't grow up as a farmer, so I didn't really know what I was looking at, but I became curious and I began to research what's happened to family farms. And what I used to think when we visited here that, this is the simple life. This is what everybody wants. Pretty much a stress-free life. Well, we sat down with one of our friends for 35 years. He's roughly my age now. And he was talking about how farming has been decreasing. I looked into it, and in Nebraska in 1935, there were about 140,000 family farms. It was really a family business, independent, autonomous. They could do what they wanted to. Today, there are 44,000 family farms, roughly. So what's happened? What's happened to the simple life? Well, it's just not possible anymore. Family farms are being squeezed out by corporate farms and by other larger farms. And the big culprit behind this are the seed companies. Did you know that if you planted seeds from your crop last year, you could probably be heavily fined or go to prison? Isn't that amazing? These seed companies have made it so that there can be very high yields, and their hybrid seeds are very, very powerful, but they force the farmers to buy from them every single year. The other thing that's happening is the only way farming is profitable is to get big. A while ago, in 1972 or something like that, there was a phrase that was going around: get big or get out. That's what's happening now. Centralization, more power being concentrated in farming, and the little guy is being squeezed out. Why do I bring this up in a Bitcoin show? Well, if you look and if you read The Creature from Jekyll Island and understand what the Fed has done to this country, you will come to see the differences and the similarities between family farming and between the U.S. economy. So buckle in. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to summarize the first couple of chapters of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Welcome to the Huddle Boomer podcast. Hey, Huddle Boomers, welcome back inside from that kind of storm that was brewing outside. As I was walking down the stairs getting ready to record this, it dawned on me that farmers can see things coming from quite a distance. As I looked out over the fields after I did that little recording, I noticed the storm. You heard the wind. I noticed the storm rolling in. You could see the rain moving across the field, and I knew I had to get inside and stay dry somewhat. That kind of paints the picture for me. That's exactly the way the Federal Reserve has been built. As we work through The Creature from Jekyll Island, as you sit with me and allow me to read some of The Creature from Jekyll Island to you, to give you an idea of what it's all about, you will appreciate that what happened to the family farm happened to the United States. The people in central authority, the people in control, have been doing things to us by plan for a long time. This episode is going to be a little bit different, kind of boring, kind of interesting, because I'm going to be reading the chapter summaries from The Creature from Jekyll Island. You will see that this week we're covering the first section of this book. Kind of thick, kind of big, kind of well footnoted. It's interesting to note that the author, in the beginning of the book, recommends that readers don't tackle reading the whole book at once, that they read the chapter summaries first. So that's what we're going to do, to give you some encouragement to go read the footnotes, read all the detail on the book. Trust me, if you do this, it doesn't even mention Bitcoin, but if you do this, you're really going to understand what's happening to money in the world. So let's get started. Pardon my head bobbing up and down, but I'm going to be literally reading The Creature from Jekyll Island to you. It begins with the journey to Jekyll Island. That's chapter 1. And the summary goes like this. The basic plan for the Federal Reserve System was drafted at a secret meeting held in November 1910 at the private resort of J.P. Morgan on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Those who attended represented the great financial institutions of Wall Street and indirectly Europe as well. The reason for secrecy was simple. Had it been known that the rival factions of the banking community had joined together, the public would have been alerted to the possibility that the bankers were plotting in agreement for the restraint of trade, which of course is exactly what they were doing. What emerged was a cartel agreement with 5 objectives. Stop the growing competition from the nation's newer banks. Obtain a franchise to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending. Get control of the reserves of all banks so that the more reckless ones would not be exposed to currency drains and bank runs. Get the taxpayer to pick up the cartel's inevitable losses, and convince Congress that the purpose was to protect the public. It was realized that the bankers would have to become partners with the politicians, and that the structure of the cartel would have to be a central bank. The record shows that the Fed has failed to achieve its stated objectives. That is, because those were never its true goals. As a banking cartel, and in terms of the 5 objectives stated above, it has been an unqualified success. That's the first chapter. Just a word on the book. You can believe that summary paragraph or not. It really doesn't matter. It's very well footnoted, very well researched, and it is unbelievably accurate, unbelievably true. Chapter 2 continues on the theme, and they said the name of the game is the bailout. That's the summary for chapter 2. Here it is. The game called bailout is not a whimsical figment of the imagination. It is real. Here are some of the big games of the past and their final scores. In 1970, Penn Central Railroad became bankrupt. The banks that it lent money to, it had taken over its board of directors and put it further into a hole, all the while extending bigger loans to cover the losses. Directors concealed reality from stockholders and made up additional loans so the company could pay dividends to keep up a false front. Directors and their banks unloaded their stock at unrealistically high prices. When the truth became public, stockholders were left holding the empty bag. When Congress was told that the collapse of Penn Central would be devastating to the public interest, it responded by granting $125 million in loan guarantees, so banks would not be at risk. The railroad failed anyway, but the banks were covered. Penn Central was nationalized into Amtrak and continues to operate at a loss. As Lockheed faced bankruptcy in 1970, Congress heard essentially the same story. Thousands would be unemployed, some contractors would go out of business, and the public would suffer greatly. So Congress guaranteed $250 million in new loans, which put Lockheed 60% deeper into debt than before. Now that government was guaranteeing the loans, it made sure Lockheed became profitable by granting lucrative defense contracts at non-competitive bids. The banks were never paid back. In 1975, New York City had reached the end of its credit rope. It had borrowed heavily to maintain an extravagant bureaucracy and mini welfare state. When Congress was told that the public would be jeopardized if city services were curtailed and that America would be disgraced, in the eyes of the world, it authorized $2.3 billion in additional loans, which more than doubled the size of the current debt. The banks continued to receive their interest. In 1978, Chrysler was near bankruptcy. Congress was told that the public would suffer if the company folded, and that it would be a blow to the American way if freedom of choice were reduced from 3 to 2 makes of automobiles. So Congress guaranteed up to $1.5 billion in new loans. The bank's previously uncollectible debt was converted into a taxpayer-backed interest-bearing asset. In 1972, the Commonwealth Bank of Detroit, worth $1.5 billion in assets, became insolvent. It had borrowed heavily from Chase Manhattan to invest in high-risk and potentially high-profit ventures. Now that it was in trouble, so was Chase. The bankers went to Washington and told the FDIC the public must be protected from the great financial hardship that would follow if Commonwealth folded. So the FDIC pumped into a $60 million loan plus federal guarantees of repayment. Chase took a minor write-down but converted most of its potential loss into taxpayer-backed assets. Wow. In 1979, the First Pennsylvania Bank of Philadelphia became insolvent. With assets in excess of $9 billion, it was 6 times the size of the Commonwealth. It too had been an aggressive player in the 70s. Now the bankers and the Federal Reserve told the FDIC that the public must be protected from the calamity of a bank failure of this size, that the national economy was at stake, perhaps even the entire world. So the FDIC gave a $325 million loan, interest-free for the first year, and half the market rate thereafter. The Fed offered money to other banks at a subsidized rate for the purpose of relending to First Penn. With that enticement, they advanced $175 million in an immediate loan, plus $1 billion in a line of credit. In 1982, Chicago's Continental Illinois became insolvent. It was the nation's 7th largest bank, with $42 billion in assets. The previous year, its profits had soared as a result of loans to high-risk business ventures for foreign governments. Although it had been the darling of market analysis, it quickly unraveled when its cash flow turned negative. Fed Chairman Volcker told the FDIC it would be unthinkable to allow the world economy to be ruined by a bank failure of this magnitude. So the FDIC assumed $4.5 billion in bad loans and took 80% ownership of the bank in the form of stock. In effect, the bank was nationalized, but no one called it that. Bailouts up to this point pale by comparison to the trillions of dollars pumped into banks, insurance companies, automobile manufacturers, and banks of other countries beginning in 2008. It started with what was called the subprime meltdown, caused by a calculated policy of the nation's largest banks to entice low-income families into accepting mortgages in excess of what they could afford. The assumption was that the value of houses would rise forever, so people could pay off old loans by taking out larger new loans based on the increasing value of real estate. These doomed mortgages were packaged together, given fancy names, and sold to naive investors and investment funds. When the day of reckoning arrived, millions of mortgage holders lost their mythical equity and their homes, while millions of investors lost their money. The banks that created this bubble were on the brink of collapse, but they told Congress they were too big to fail, because if they did, so would America itself. Congress dutifully approved virtually every request for taxpayer funding, regardless of the amount. This legalized plunder was coordinated by 2 secretaries of the Treasury, Henry Paulson and Timothy Geithner, who became from the banking fraternity and used their positions of public trust to protect and enrich the cartel. All of the money was provided by the Federal Reserve, acting as the lender of last resort. That was one of the purposes for which it had been designed. We must not forget the phrase, the lender of last resort, means that the money is created out of nothing, resulting in the confiscation of wealth through inflation. Chapter 4, it's called Home Sweet Loan. And the summary of Chapter 4 is kind of an interesting one. If you think about what we just talked about with all of the bailouts for banks, this is absolutely tied to it. Go back to the reading. Our present-day problems within the savings and loan industry can be traced back to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Americans were becoming impressed by the theories of socialism and soon embraced the concept that it was proper for government to provide benefits for its citizens and to protect them from economic hardship. Under the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, new government agencies were established which purported to protect depositors in its S&Ls and to subsidize home mortgages for the middle class. These measures distorted the laws of supply and demand, and from that point forward, the housing industry was moved out of the free market and into the political arena. Once the pattern of government intervention had been established, there began a long, unbroken series of federal rules and regulations that were the source of windfall profits for managers, appraisers, brokers, developers, and builders. They also weakened the industry by encouraging unsound business practices and high-risk investments. When these investments failed, and when the value of real estate began to drop, many S&Ls became insolvent. The federal insurance fund was soon depleted, and the government was confronted with its own promise to bail out these companies, but not having any money to do so. The response of the regulators was to create an accounting gimmick whereby insolvent thrifts could be made to appear solvent and thus continue in business. This postponed the inevitable and made matters considerably worse. The failed S&Ls continued to lose billions of dollars each month and added greatly to the ultimate cost of the bailout, all of which could have been eventually to have been paid by the common man out of taxes and inflation. The ultimate cost is estimated at over $1 trillion. Congress appears to be unable to act and is strangely silent. This is understandable. Many representatives and senators are the beneficiaries of great, generous donations from the S&Ls. But perhaps the main reason is that Congress itself is the main culprit in this crime. In either case, politicians would like to talk about something else. The larger view of the S&L industry is a cartel within a cartel. The fiasco could never have happened without the cartel called the Federal Reserve System, standing by to create the vast amounts of bailout money pledged by Congress. Unbelievable. I hope you're listening carefully to these words, because the Federal Reserve, there's nothing federal about it, and there's nothing in reserve about it. It's a cartel. The next chapter is called Nearer to the Heart's Desire, talking about the IMF. I'll continue the reading. The IMF and the World Bank were created at a meeting of global financiers and politicians held at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. Their announced goals were to facilitate international trade and to stabilize the exchange rates of national currencies. The unannounced goals were quite different. They were the elimination of the gold exchange standard as the basis of currency valuation and the establishment of world socialism. The method by which gold was to be eliminated in international trade was to replace it with a world currency which the IMF, acting as a world central bank, would create out of nothing. The method by which world socialism was to be established was to use the World Bank to transfer money, disguised as loans, to the governments of underdeveloped countries, and to do so in such a way as to ensure the demise of free enterprise. The money was to be delivered from the hands of politicians and bureaucrats into the hands of other politicians and bureaucrats. When the money comes from government, goes to government, and is administered by government, the result will be the expansion of government. The theoreticians who dominated the conference at Bretton Woods were the well-known Fabian socialists from England, John Maynard Keynes, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Harry Dexter White. White became the first executive director of the United States at the IMF. The Fabians are an elite group of intellectuals who agree with communists as to the goal of socialism, but disagreed over tactics. Whereas communists advocate revolution by force and violence, Fabians advocate gradualism and the transformation of society through legislation. It was learned in later years that Henry Dexter White was a member of a communist espionage ring. Thus, hidden from view, there was a complex drama taking place in which the two intellectual founders of the Bretton Woods Accords were Fabian socialists and a communist, working together to bring about their world goal, world socialism. Capital for the IMF and the World Bank comes from the industrialized nations, with the United States putting up the most. Currencies such as the dollar, yen, mark, and franc are augmented many times in the amount in the form of credits. These are merely promises by the member governments to get the money from the taxpayers if the bank gets into trouble with its loans. The IMF gradually is evolving into a central bank for the world with the World Bank as its lending arm. It's become the engine to transfer wealth to underdeveloped countries. This has lowered the economic level of the donating countries, but has not raised the level of the recipients. The money has simply disappeared down the drain of political corruption and waste. Beginning to tie together how this thing was developed globally and with their eyes wide open, and calling it the Federal Reserve, I'm not reading, this is my opinion, calling it the Federal Reserve because it makes it sound like it's our government agency. This was all in a process toward building the New World Order, which is the heading of the next chapter, Building the New World Order. I begin. The international version of the game called bailout is similar to the domestic version in that the overall objective is to have the taxpayers cover the defaulted loans so that the interest payments can continue going to the banks. The differences are, 1, instead of justifying this as protecting the American people, the pretense is that it is to save the world from poverty. And 2, the main money pipeline goes from the Federal Reserve through the IMF, World Bank. Otherwise, the rules are basically the same. There's another dimension to the game, however, that involves more than the mere profits and scam. It is a conscious and deliberate evolution of the IMF World Bank into a world central bank with the power to issue a world fiat currency. And that's an important step in an even larger plan to build a true world government within the framework of the United Nations. Economically strong nations are not candidates for surrendering their sovereignty to a world government. Therefore, through loans that will never be paid back, the IMF World Bank directs the massive transfer of wealth from the industrialized nations to the less developed nations. This ongoing process eventually drains their economies to the point where they also will be in need of assistance. No longer capable of independent action, they will accept the loss of sovereignty in return for international aid. The less developed countries, on the other hand, are being brought to the New World Order along an entirely different route. Many of these countries are ruled by petty tyrants who care little for their people except how to extract more taxes from them without causing a revolt. Loans from the IMF World Bank are used primarily to perpetuate themselves and their ruling parties in power, and that's exactly what the IMF World Bank intends. Rhetoric about helping the poor notwithstanding, the true goal of the transfer of wealth disguised as loans is to get control over the leaders of the less developed countries. After these despots get used to the taste of such an unlimited supply of sweet cash, they will never be able to break the habit. They will be content, already are content, to become the little gold-plated cogs in the giant machinery of the world government. Ideology means nothing to them. Capitalist, communist, socialist, fascist, what does it matter? so long as the money keeps coming. The IMF, World Bank, literally is buying these countries and using our money to do it. The recent inclusion of Red China and the former Soviet bloc on the list of IMF's World Bank recipient countries signals the final phase of the game. Now that Latin America and Africa have been purchased into the New World Order, this is the final frontier. In a relatively short time span, China, Russia, and the Eastern European countries have now become the biggest borrowers, and they have already become arrears in their payments. This is where the action will be months ahead. Thank you for paying attention. What you've done so far is read that much of The Creature from Jekyll Island. I'm not suggesting that my summary reading here is a substitute, but it's a good place to start. When you've got the summaries of the entire book read, then you can begin to read the book, and then you can understand what's been going on. So let me summarize. I began with an introduction looking at the cornfields in Nebraska. And I talked about how centralization and big government and big industry has really choked out the family farmer. And you need to get bigger in order to survive. Simple fact that's occurring in rural America. Compare that to the planning just gone over from the first section of The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's the same thing. Central authorities got together, decided on ways to enrich themselves, expanded that globally, and put together a framework that would support the elites forever. Bitcoin is the one way that people can get out of that system. And we want to educate you, give you the tools so that you can make your own decision about whether or not to get involved in the conversion of economics to Bitcoin, away from the Federal Reserve. I should say, I'm not a financial expert, nor is my co-host, my brother Greg. Neither one of us are licensed financial experts, so do your own research. Look at everything I'm telling you. Read the book for yourself. Read other books for yourself, and make a decision. There's a lot going on right now. We just want to summarize and make it possible for you to consider getting into Bitcoin and helping with the conversion. That's it for this week. Next week we'll pick up and we'll go on the next chapter or the next section of The Creature from Jekyll Island. I hope you're enjoying this. As always, we want to tell you to please visit us at hodlandtees.org. And we like you. We love you. Stack sats, stay humble, and we'll see you next time.